Star Trek. Watch it about Star Wars.
No, I didn't. We not under. For 10 years, I kicked the back end of some of these people. Star Wars is the movie version of the Beatles.
Joe,
No, the Beatles are good.
Star Wars was good.
Yeah, word.
Star Wars came out in
You
the
think Star Wars overrated or you think
I'm not a Star Wars guy.
Wars,
The first two are dope. But
And Star
after that-
Trek.
That's what I've seen.
Overhyped.
I've seen like the first couple. That's what I've seen.
Star Wars in the early 80s, that was something.
Fire.
Who directed them?
George
One of the
Lucas.
richest
We
niggas
never
on the
heard
planet.
from him again once Christopher
Yes,
Nolan
we did,
turned
nigga.
18.
What you talking about? George Lucas.
Once Christopher Nolan turned 18, I ain't heard a peep about George Lucas.
Yes, you did, nigga.
When?
Phantom of the Menace, all that shit came out.
No,
New
that
shit.
nigga's one of the
Watch
richest
your mouth,
niggas
Joe.
planet.
We understand that. That's
heard
not my
from him.
argument. That's
Okay.
not my argument.
You have heard of it.
We understand that. Jordan Peele is rich. We come in here and kick his movies down in the back and all that.
Jordan Peele is a welfare case compared to
Give me,
George Lucas.
all right, give me some more. Phantom of the Opera. All right.
Menace.
What else he did?
Yo,
What else
all
he
the
did?
Star Wars
Star
he did.
Wars has a cult.
I need more than that.
It has a cult.
I need more than that. What else he did?
Indiana Jones.
Came up with Indiana Jones.
Indiana Jones
There we
pretty
go.
big.
Yo, don't say his name again when I say Christopher Nolan.
Oh, no. That,
Two
Do me a
different
favor. When I say
directors.
Christopher Nolan, don't mention George Lucas to me. If y'all saying, what did y'all say? Field of Dreams? What did y'all say?
I just pulled them.
You better pull up Christopher Nolan. Don't say George Lucas' name
I'm
again.
gonna keep it a buck with you. I did just pull up.
Christopher Nolan.
No,
Yeah.
I pulled up Lucas.
Now, listen, I want
Outside of Star
Hey,
Wars,
pull up Christopher Nolan.
no, we ain't gotta do that.
Wars,
Look, we ain't gotta do that.
Red
We ain't gotta do that.
This-
We ain't
this
gotta
don't
do
So
that.
how come when I keep saying
We ain't gotta do
the
that.
God Christopher
We
Nolan,
ain't gotta do
they keep telling me about Star Trek?
He don't need to make nothing else. Star Wars is what it is. Enterprise, millions of billions of dollars.
That's a good point.
He doesn't need to make anything
And for
else.
50 years.
We talking about
too.
good
You
movies
talking
though,
about,
not
Joe?
about what they made. Talking about good movies.
Yeah.
I don't think, and this may be a Joe Budden hot take, when Christopher Nolan name come up, George Lucas can go sit down.
A lot of niggas can go
I'm
sit
with
down
you.
when his name
I'm
come
with
up.
you.
George Lucas
Bam.
can go sit down
No, he
somewhere.
doesn't.
I don't give a fuck. White
Memento.
America want to
There are moments on Joe Budden's platform where the music stops, the industry chatter fades, and something else entirely takes over. These are the tangents, the long detours into cultural disputes that feel at once absurd and profound. It is in those moments that Joe, ever the conductor of chaos, reveals something about the way we argue, the way we align our identities with the art we consume, the way taste itself becomes theater. The debate over Star Trek versus Star Wars and the comparison between George Lucas and Christopher Nolan was one of those moments, less a film seminar and more a collision between personality, generational perspective, and the elasticity of pop culture itself. To understand what was at stake in that back and forth, you have to appreciate Budden's style of reasoning. He doesn't traffic in careful scholarship or footnoted arguments. He builds momentum through exaggeration, through heat, through the performance of certainty even when he admits confusion. That's what makes his takes feel alive. He will tell you Star Wars is the cinematic equivalent of the Beatles, and in the same breath confess he hasn't seen most of the franchise. He will dismiss George Lucas as a ghost who vanished after the early films, then turn around and canonize Christopher Nolan as untouchable. The logic is less about factual accuracy and more about staking emotional territory, planting a flag in the terrain of culture, and daring anyone else to uproot it. His co-hosts, especially those unafraid to push back, serve as the necessary ballast. Without resistance, the Joe Budden podcast would collapse into pure monologue. With resistance, it becomes a theater of argument, a showcase for how people use movies and music as proxies for deeper disputes. The Star Trek versus Star Wars moment was one of those perfect collisions. Joe's refusal to surrender his take, the co-host's insistence on accountability, the clash of memory, taste, and the sheer ridiculousness of comparing Christopher Nolan to George Lucas in the same breath. On the surface, it might seem like a nerd debate, Trekkies versus Jedi, space operas versus cerebral sci-fi, auteur theory versus franchise building. But beneath it lies a deeper question. What do we demand from our cultural legends? Is greatness defined by a single world-shaking creation, or by a consistent body of work that reinvents itself with every release? Do we measure George Lucas by the mythology he unleashed in 1977, or by his patchy, awkward follow-ups? Do we elevate Nolan because he seems incapable of making a small film without cosmic ambition, or do we remind ourselves that ambition alone is not always brilliance? Joe's dismissal of Lucas is telling. In his framing, Lucas delivered a thunderclap, the original trilogy, and then receded. The fact that he became an industry titan, that he revolutionized special effects through industrial light and magic, that he altered sound design, that he built a merchandising empire, all of that vanishes in Joe's shorthand. To him, Lucas is a name that peaked early and then faded. Nolan, in contrast, is positioned as a modern master, a figure who can be invoked as shorthand for cinematic weight. When Joe says you better not bring Lucas into the same sentence as Nolan, what he is really doing is drawing a line between eras, between the messy mythology of late 20th century blockbusters and the sleek, cerebral brand of 21st century spectacle. But his co-host won't let him get away with it. That is the beauty of these exchanges. They expose the limits of Joe's bombast. They remind the audience that taste is not law, that the mythology of Star Wars cannot be dismissed with a wave of the hand. To say Star Wars is like the Beatles is to recognize that it transcended the screen, became a cultural language, an intergenerational shorthand for imagination itself. You cannot speak of cinema's evolution without Lucas's fingerprints. Nolan may have the Dark Knight trilogy, Inception, Interstellar, Dunkirk, and Oppenheimer, but Lucas has an entire galaxy, a cathedral of fandom that still pulses decades later. What emerges from the debate is less a verdict than a revelation about how we argue with art. Joe treats culture like a sparring partner. The point is not to be right, but to land the punch. His co-hosts, representing fandoms with longer memories, push back with reminders of history, continuity, and context. Together, they create a microcosm of how culture itself is consumed today, as performance, as argument, as identity. The Star Trek angle is just as important. For Joe, Star Trek becomes the proxy for everything he finds dull, too slow, too academic. Where Star Wars is operatic and mythic, Trek is technical and methodical. His dismissal of it reveals his bias for spectacle over philosophy, for the visceral thrill over the slow burn. Yet Trekkies for decades have argued the opposite. That Star Trek offered moral parables, speculative thought experiments, and a diversity of representation long before Hollywood pretended to care. The very fact that Joe could use Trek as a punchline tells us something about how different fandoms carry different forms of cultural capital. In the comparison of Lucas and Nolan, something even more profound is at play. Lucas represents the accidental genius, the man who birthed a world larger than himself and then struggled to control it. Nolan represents the calculated craftsman, the deliberate architect whose films arrive with precision. One built an empire almost by mistake, the other builds cathedrals on purpose. Joe aligns with Nolan because Nolan represents the kind of consistency that makes sense to him, the career as a series of undeniable statements. Lucas, to Joe, looks like inconsistency, a fluke whose empire was bigger than his own artistry. But what Joe underestimates is that culture does not measure greatness solely by consistency. Sometimes one creation is enough. Star Wars changed the architecture of global cinema. It rewired Hollywood economics, it expanded merchandising into a primary revenue stream, inspired generations of filmmakers, it reshaped sound and special effects, it gave the culture a mythology as durable as ancient legend. Lucas may not have Nolan's filmography, but he has something Nolan himself would admit envy toward, a mythology that will outlive us all. And yet, Joe's stubbornness is part of the fun. His refusal to back down makes the conversation alive. In dismissing Lucas, he forces his co-hosts to mount the defense, to articulate why Lucas still matters, to remind everyone listening that history cannot be erased by swagger alone. That dynamic, the bombast colliding with the correction, is what makes the Joe Budden podcast a strange new forum for cultural theory. It is not academic, not careful, but is alive with the very energy that culture itself thrives on: argument, identity, passion. The debate over Lucas versus Nolan, Star Wars versus Star Trek, is really a debate over how we measure greatness. Is it innovation or consistency? Is it mythology or craftsmanship? Is it impact or precision? Joe comes down firmly on the side of Nolan, but in doing so, he reveals something larger.